And we're live. Man, I tell you what, that countdown gets me every time with that guitar
Every
solo.
time.
Every
Love
time.
it.
So guys, welcome whether you're watching us on LinkedIn Live or YouTube Live. My name's Matt Price, manager of enablement here at Object First. I'm joined by two very special guests, as you can see with me, Anthony Cusimano and Ryan Post. And today's session, what we wanted to do is highlight three key settings that are going to be fundamental with any data protection strategy when you're looking at Veeam plus Object First. And we want to make sure that we clarify these for you so that there's no misunderstandings here, misconceptions. And really, with that, let's just go right into what is a best practice data protection strategy. So, the 32110, you guys might have heard of before. We've written a blog on it over on our website at objectfirst.com. And essentially, 3 copies of your data is always paramount. And remember, production does count as one of those. 2 different media types or sets. You've got one that absolutely needs to be in a different geography, so geographically diverse. And you also need to make sure one is air gapped. And you've got to test all these before you go through the trouble of getting them off site. So 0 stands for 0 errors. And we really accomplish that with Veeam and Object First using Sure Backup to make sure that they're recoverable. You've tested everything and everything checks all the checks that we go through. So what about immutability though? So with ransomware being such a hot topic in today's climate, we also need to make sure that we fully understand how to make those backups immutable so they can't be infected with ransomware. So when we get started talking about this, Ryan is going to take us through the lab and showcase some of these settings. But the first thing we want to bring up is the difference between backup retention that you guys are probably very familiar with, as well as the immutability window that gets set in Veeam when you add in a repository. So, Ryan, talk to us a bit about the differences between these.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, starting off, everybody knows what backup retention is. How long do you need to keep backups around for until they can go away and you don't need to recover from them anymore? And there's all sorts of things that jump into retention, whether it's just a straight daily retention for the nightly backups, but then adding on a grandfather, father, son style or GFS, where maybe you add some weekly backups, monthly, yearly backups that you have for a longer term retention. Whereas immutability itself, right, is truly going to be how long do you need to keep these backups to where they cannot be affected, they cannot be deleted, modified, on the system that it sits in. And it really, the two work together, and it really comes down to capacity and why they work together.
Yeah, absolutely. So Anthony, in your past experience, how have you seen the immutability and the backup retention perhaps misunderstood?
Yeah, it's a big one because I think a lot of people claim immutability or think they have immutability when really they have software immutability, but their data is still quite mutable.
Yeah.
So, the I think the first place we really saw immutability kind of creep up in the industry was in the cloud, right? S3 storage and different cloud vendors. That data is truly immutable because there's no way for you, the end user, to disable that immutability, turn it off, delete that bucket, or shut off the servers where your cloud data lies. The only real risk there is if the cloud provider goes down or something happens in that case. Now, on-prem, the immutability situation is kind of variable, right? Like you might have a immutable bucket, but if the box that it resides on, if the space and storage that's maintaining that immutability has any kind of administrative access where you could factory reset or overwrite those permissions, your data is not really immutable at that point. It's actually quite deletable. So it's important to understand the 0 access that can come with immutability. If you're able to truly lock this thing down and make your software, your storage, your hardware pretty much ransomware proof, meaning that no backend access, no root access, no way to factory reset the device. The only thing that's going to destroy it at this point is the rogue meteor. If that happens, we've got much bigger problems to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So Ryan, why don't you walk us through this? I'm going to go ahead and kick up the lab and let's take a peek at, what are the differences and really where to start.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the immutability option that you have within Veeam, and we'll jump into one we have set up here with UTB. And if we look at the properties here, it's the same concept setting this up, but the step where it really gets enabled is going to be here on the bucket selection and the folder selection where you're going to send the Veeam backups to. And it all comes down to the second checkbox. So if you've seen some of our other videos, where we have set up the appliance, the checkbox for versioning that enables the object lock API is turned on by default. So you have to have that checked. It's going to give an error if you don't. So we need to make sure that it is checked. And there's a lot of recommendations around here too on how many days do you need immutability for. And I think that the first conversation really needs to start internally with your leadership, with the stakeholders of your organization to figure out what that number needs to be. And we talk to all sorts of customers that range from they just want a few days of immutability to others that maybe want that 30, 60, 90-day immutability. But that all plays into capacity and how does it affect the storage that it's living on. Yeah. And Veeam has a great document about block generation on how that works. And typically that first restore point that gets written is going to have an in, which is going to be the 14 days in this example, plus 10. That next day is going to be in plus 9, all the way down to n plus 1. So it really helps with cleanup efforts. And that really came into play when Veeam came out with capacity tier and trying to help save on transaction costs, to help with the IO that happens within those public clouds, because a lot of that is money. And in some of my previous conversations in my Veeam life with customers, is a lot of times the cloud economics weren't fully understood. They go in and they put that 90-day retention in that cloud provider of choice, and they don't understand why they have 120 days worth of restore points, why things aren't cleaning up properly because the retention's only 30 days. So I do want to hop over real quick, just to another console here with a job setting. And of course, there's the simple retention here for this particular job, 30 days. And since with 14-day immutability, only about 24 of those days are immutable. And things will properly clean up once we need to get rid of those oldest restore points. But then you start looking at things like GFS retention. A lot of these become full backups in the chain, and they become immutable until they're actually need to be removed from the actual retention itself. So again, all this plays into capacity and not setting it too much to where you're using too much storage on your repository from Veeam. They can clean up properly.
Yeah, Ryan, I think that's the really big thing here when we talk about misunderstanding and a potentially misunderstood concept is, what is your setting actually going to dictate on disk? Like, how is that actually going to look once the backup job has been running a month, 2 months, 3 months down the road? Is it going to be what you had in mind and envisioned when you created your retention policy, or is it going to mimic something different because these two settings weren't fully understood? So I think that's really critical when you do a sizing exercise and you look at your change rate and you look at long-term retention versus short-term. How much of this are you going to tier off to the cloud versus keeping on-prem? These two settings are going to be fundamental to make sure that you size, your retention adequately.
Definitely. That's, again, I think where that first initial conversation that takes place happens internally. So you get an understanding of what you need. So then you can properly size and have the proper expectations, not just for your on-prem and how much you would need capacity there, but how much spend are you looking to have in the public cloud, if that's going to be your object storage of choice, and outside of your data center.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ryan, when we looked at the OOTB appliance just a moment ago, I noticed that it was added in just as a direct repository, but we've got, another capability that we could leverage it with inside Veeam using the scale out backup repository, right?
Yeah, we definitely can. And OOTB itself can be either part of the scale out backup repository as capacity tier, or it can also be performance tier as well. And we truly want to be that performance tier, right? That first backup locally, and then tie in with a cloud provider of your choice. And insert cloud provider choice here in our lab, but currently, Wasabi set up for doing some of that offloading. And there's a couple settings here, I think, that a lot of customers, somewhat get confused on, and how the scale out backup repository works. The performance tier is pretty straightforward. This is exactly what's going to happen local, the first landing spot for the Veeam backup and replication job that takes place. In this case, we have a single bucket that we set up for performance tier. I do want to make a note here on this particular step, and it's really a Veeam option right now, and with the Smart Object Storage API that came out with version 12 that allows Veeam to write directly to object storage, because we are fully supporting that API, you can only have one extent here in the performance tier that supports the Smart Object Storage API currently. So that's why we have that one bucket here. But we could add, potentially another extent here locally if needed. And we would recommend in that case still using the data locality where or the performance option where the backup chain stays together wherever it lands. The other option that we have here is capacity tier, and this isn't, again, our example here being Wasabi, but it could be any of the other vendors out there, AWS from Amazon, Azure Blob, Google Cloud as being an extension. But there's two checkboxes that you have here. There's a copy and a move. In our example here, we have a copy. This means as soon as that data is written into the performance tier and that smart entity or the smart object from Veeam being written gets fully written into disk on performance tier, it's going to go ahead and offload and make a copy right away within the capacity tier of choice. And again, that capacity tier could be in another location. Yeah. So again, that just provides, again, that second copy right away. Again, a different location or different media type, being a public cloud. Now, we also have the second checkbox there for move, and there's customers that use just the move option. And this is impacted by capacity as well, and maybe also plays into that immutability window that is set as well, as far as being able to actually move and clean up those restore points. But if I was to have just this button check or checkbox checked here, anything older than 14 days would be moved. And ideally, it cleans up the restore point locally, leaves a shell. So Veeam knows exactly what restore points are available, but all the data then essentially resides within the capacity tier, after that certain time. And what's great about that is that Veeam controls all of that retention, knows exactly where the data lives, where it needs to pull it from. So if you had a crazy, 120-day retention and you offload after 30 days and everything cleans up, you go and choose the restore point that you want. You don't have to worry about, is it living locally? Is it living in the cloud? Veeam knows exactly what to do, pulls all that information in, and pieces everything together for that restore. And I'd say a lot of customers are using both of these together. So ideally, let's go ahead and get the second copy right away with that copy checkbox. And let's go ahead and move data older. Let's limit our capacity on-prem. And maybe that's just because they don't want as much on-prem. They want to leverage it, more long-term within the job itself. So the biggest thing to keep in mind, even with both of these options, is if we jump back over to another job here real quick, is the retention is completely handled by this single job. So again, no matter if it's being offloaded, copied, moved, the combination of both, the retention is set at the job level and has nothing to do with that move option that's in the capacity tier. Again, everything's handled here, so Veeam knows about everything that's happening with this particular job.
Yeah, so essentially what I'm hearing is we've got to make sure that all these settings are known when you really go into a sizing exercise like we've been talking about, because there's several different ways that you could configure Veeam plus UPI together that would have a direct impact on how much data you need to house on-prem. So one of the other things, Ryan, I wanted to bring up just for a point of clarification is when you look at the scale-out backup repository in Veeam, we talk about performance tier, capacity tier, and you mentioned it when you were going through your description about data placement policies. There's also a data placement policy identified as performance. So one of the things that we need to make sure we don't confuse is when we say performance tier, we're not necessarily talking about the placement policy. Now, we do recommend using performance as the placement policy, but the point I'm making is there's a performance tier and a capacity tier, and then there's a placement policy. So those are not the same thing. And I just wanted to bring that up because if you look at the placement policies, we don't want any confusion there also. So definitely stick with performance on that as well.
Yep. Yeah, and just to clarify those two, that the exact name is data locality. I mean, if a full backup gets written, the following incrementals will stay where that full backup was written within the performance tier extent. Whereas that performance gives you a little bit of flexibility of splitting up the full backups and incrementals to different tiers. So maybe depending on the types of storage that was available, where you want the faster stuff to go to the faster storage for the incrementals, and then on the weekends, right, those full backups go to the maybe the slower, just where it has more time to back up. So a lot of different options. And one of the reasons Veeam came out with that scale out backup repository, a few versions back. So.
Yep. And the one other thing I'll mention before we go to backup copy jobs, Ryan, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, is one of the very useful capabilities of the scale out backup repository is the very first word, scale. So what happens when you need to grow your Veeam repository? Well, you would bring in another storage target, you would add it as an extent, and it would pool your cumulative storage. Using UPI, that's not even a requirement because we do that at the cluster level inside of our 2E interface, which we've got videos on that on YouTube. But essentially what that allows us to do is you add in your UPI cluster once into Veeam, and anytime you need to grow the capacity, let's say you start with a single UPI node and you add 2, 3, more to that cluster, the action is you simply bring it into the cluster on the UPI side, rescan, and Veeam sees the increased capacity. So there's nothing else you have to manage on the Veeam front end.
Yeah, definitely. And it all goes back to that single namespace service point that we add into Veeam here. And you can see from the UPI dashboard, if I log back in with where we need to go, is it provides that service point right away, right on the dashboard and what's being used to add into Veeam. And so once you've added that once, it's all that's needed. As Matt mentioned, the TUI interface goes right through to join the cluster. And one of the things to make note of is we auto load balance, right? We will move objects from the first node over to the second node, not everything at once or half of it at once. It's going to be over time. We don't want to, handling network performance or having degradation there, while we do that. So, exactly.
I do want to make a quick point here because I know, our audience, if you're looking at Object First UPI or if you're a super experienced user of backup software, I think it's important to kind of note if this is complicated, if this seems like something that is a lot to learn, a lot of this comes down to what level of recovery point objective, what level of recovery time objective, RPO, RTO, and how much budget do you have, right? Like if you think about ransomware as a concept, when it attacks, it's always going to look for the most valuable information it can get its hands on first. That's why it's so important, like what Ryan's shown in his demo here, to ensure that the most valuable data, the data that you'd want to restore from, is kept locally in that performance tier, ideally somewhere you can recover from quickly. Yep. Maximizing your ability to kind of give and take with what stays local versus what gets archived, what you need to recover quickly versus what you can pull down slower. That's where the math and mastery comes into play. And it's not something you can just get, after watching one LinkedIn live session with us, but spend time thinking about this, discussing it with your other IT admins and identifying what do we need to be able to recover in a moment's notice versus what long-term. And also I would add test all of this. Make sure you're running recoveries from both locations, seeing how long it's going to take, simulate what would happen if a ransomware were to occur and you had to pull from that capacity tier, and really start to understand how this impacts your recovery time, not just how it impacts the backup window.
Definitely. And not to be too redundant, because I know I brought up, a couple times already, and Anthony just brought up internal discussion. And I think that's important, and make sure everyone's on the same page. There's too many conversations I've had where IT wants one thing, the C-level positions want one thing, legal wants another, and there's not everybody's not on the same page. It makes it more difficult. And, and it comes down to recovery, right? Most VMs you're recovering within 24 hours, maybe, 72 hours at most, where files, that's another scenario. That may be 90 days out if that's what your retention looks like. How often are you doing that? And pulling a file down is going to be a lot less transactional when you start looking at public clouds than it would be for, on-prem. So just things to keep in mind.
If you need a conversation starter with your local IT admins or VP of IT, whoever owns the budget, just remember that the ransomware in your ecosystem lies dormant for months, and it is figuring out what is most important. So if you don't figure it out, they already have. So it is always important to act as if it's already in your walls And it's looking at what can I do the most amount of damage encrypting, locking down, making it so you don't have access to it. And then figuring out how do we ensure we can recover this if we need to.
Yeah, completely agree. So, Ryan and Anthony talking about this same theme. So we've brought up the potential misconception or misunderstanding of the differences between immutability windows and backup retention. We've talked about where and how you can add OOTB into Veeam, whether it's a standalone repository or potentially the benefits of adding it into a scale out backup repository. But when we talk about this whole 32110, getting that data offsite to the cloud, the mechanism that Veeam typically relies on here is your backup copy jobs. So maybe we can take a quick peek at some of the settings in the backup copy jobs to clarify some of those, because I know there's a couple different settings
Sure.
that were recently introduced in backup copy jobs.
Sure. And yeah, I think, there is some confusion, around that as well. I think, looking at what we just talked about with that scale out backup repository, with that capacity tier, with, the nomenclature of copy, right? It is a very, very similar concept. The biggest thing is that a backup copy job is a completely independent job, right? So if you go back to that retention that was set up with a primary job, the primary backup having a daily retention or the running retention, if there's some added GFS or store points, all that's handled by that single job. And the scale out backup repository is what handles that copy mechanism or the move mechanism for that. And again, that's one retention though, across that scale out repository. The use case for a backup copy job is, yes, let's make another copy of those backups, but let's use a completely different repository. And the great thing is that it could be another standalone repository, like a standalone OOTB, but it could also be a scale out backup repository being the target for the backup copy. So now you get the benefits of additional backup copy, maybe to another data center, to another Veeam backup repository that's a scale repository, and then that gets offloaded into the cloud. So if we take a look at the backup copy job here real quick, there's two options. There is an immediate copy and there is a periodic copy. So mirroring versus pruning. And really the biggest thing to understand here is very similar to the capacity tier copy. Immediate copy is as soon as it's written, it's going to go ahead and push a copy over to the backup copy target. Whereas that periodic pruning is going to run on a schedule, and based on time, it will offload, but it's going to use the most recent and available restore point as the copy restore point. Again, capacity is always a big discussion with that, how much it's going to take up. But I think one of the advantages that you do get with a backup copy job is the potential use of a completely different retention. So you could have that first primary local copy in your main data center, or maybe one of your remote offices, and it's only a 14-day retention, but you could create a backup copy over into your central headquarters, and it's got a completely different retention. So you could go 30 days versus 14. You could add GFS or store points. So again, completely independent between the two, which is, I think, a positive. And again, if this was going into then capacity tier was something back then as that repository, you could have super long-term retention in that cloud capacity tier. Again, immutable all the way. Especially if you're using OOTB, first backup's immutable, second backup copy maybe to another OOTB closer being immutable, and then off to the public cloud where immutability is supported. You got protection all the way through, and that immutability will be different all the way through on each tier of storage.
What is important is that it stays immutable. That is
exactly
truly key.
So
and the reason being for that is, again, we don't know what is going to happen when ransomware strikes, or if there's simply a disaster, right? And that's the one thing no one can plan for. I live in Florida, as you all know. Hurricanes, flooding, tornadoes, that can wipe out a data center just as easily as any aggressive ransomware. So being able to think about how you can recover to a secondary location, knowing what kind of hardware you might need there, it's also important as you start to move your backup data to those secondary locations as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I see the backup copy like you guys are talking about, completely agree with everything. You've got the potential use of WAN accelerators, which is another Veeam component. So for inter-office data transfers where you manage everything. So there's a lot of mechanisms, to summarize. There's a lot of mechanisms built into Veeam that allows you to move data or you need that data to live, whether it's on-prem, your other location, like a DR site, your other data center, public cloud. There's several different ways to get the data there. But what I think we all agree on, it's never been more critical to make sure that data is immutable, because that is what is getting compromised more and more these days. And, Anthony, you said it earlier, I'm a huge proponent of Veeam Sure Backup and testing, and OOTB powers that. OOTB has the performance to actually do the Sure Backup in the data labs to make sure those VMs are fully recoverable and your workloads have been tested. I mean, all the way to like ping and heartbeat and script testing. So thorough testing, not just will it turn on, but will it turn on and respond as it should? And I genuinely think that's arguably one of the most critical elements to this whole story, because if you've got 20 backups on 3 continents and all of them are immutable, but you've never tested, what do you really have? Do you even have the ability to recover? So testing before you go to, the configurations of getting this data offsite is absolutely critical. So I really feel like we're going to have a future video on all things Sure Backup. But for today, just in summary, I think the 3-2-1-1-0 best practice strategy is never been more critical. I don't know what your guys' thoughts are, but I definitely think we almost might need to throw in another one, like at least one copy immutable, but I almost want to put a star and say all these copies need to be immutable.
Well, I think with what Ryan showed, being able to write a copy to another scale out backup repository, I mean, you're almost 3-2-1-1 squared at that point, right. Which that's a lot of numbers, and I can't do math, so I'm not going to. But I mean, you are truly building out something that's not only immutable, but it's recovery guaranteed at any cost, which you basically need to exist as a business today.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think with all these settings, and as organizations discuss, I mean, Veeam provides these powerful capabilities to really architect this the way that you want. I mean, if you really truly want to keep it, in your data centers, you have that option now, especially with version 12, being able to go direct to object storage, with backup jobs, the backup copy jobs, and something like OOPI can help handle that. But if you want to go to the public cloud and leverage that, you already are looking as part of your vision, you want to get backups there, you have that option as well. And because Veeam is handling everything, and especially when backing up to OOPI, those are all the restore points live. You go to one console, one place, for that.
Absolutely agree. So any parting thoughts, any final thoughts you guys want to share before we wrap things up?
I've said it already, but I'm just going to say it again. Test. Yes. Everything you've seen today. Should you go off and decide you want to implement this strategy for yourself, please go do that. But make sure you've also tested the recovery scenarios. And don't just test recovery. Ransomware loves to destroy hardware too. So imagine, what if your network switch has been completely hosed? What if your ESX has been completely terminated? You have to reformat and refresh all of that in addition to restore. So test realistic recovery scenarios and get familiar with what can go wrong.
Yep.
And I think, like I've said again, just like Andy just repeated himself again, internal discussions, always important. Make sure all parties within your organization are on the same page, because one way is going to spend a lot more money, one way could save money. Find that happy medium, or what's going to be best. So it's good on the pocketbook, and it's good on the functionality. So
yeah, completely agree. And it's never DNS's fault, right? It's never DNS. to your point, Anthony, you won't truly know until you test this stuff, A to Z, including recovery. Completely agree with you. So guys, thank you so much for joining us on today's session. Hopefully this clarified some of these settings, that the Veeam and OOPI joint combination leverage, because there are several different places that are essentially supplementary to each other. And it's important to know the differences. So if you've got any final questions, like any additional information, please feel free to reach out to us at any point. You can reach us at info@objectfirst.com, and we'd be happy to carry the conversation further. With that, also make sure, if you're watching us on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be publishing more content as the days and weeks go by. So hopefully you guys can catch us there. And if you're watching us on LinkedIn, be sure to follow us there. And until next time, guys, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode.